Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Fifth Estate here at the Wheeler Centre. My name's Sally Warhaft, and I'm thrilled to be the host of our session tonight, which we've called He Said, He Said. This session came off the back of the debate and the vote recently in our federal parliament about gay marriage. That's not the topic for tonight's conversation. We want to go a lot deeper than that. But something that came out of conversations that Dennis hadn't put to me is that it's very, very rare that you would hear a conversation about sex between a gay man and a straight man. And we thought this would be a great place to have that conversation. So it's a pleasure to introduce my two guests this evening. Dennis Altman is a professor of politics at La Trobe University. He's also the director of the Institute for Human Security there. And he was the visiting professor of Australian Studies at Harvard, which I remember when I was there. It sounded like a lot of fun. He's the author of many, many books, among them Global Sex, Gore Vidal's America, and Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, which was republished this year on its 40th anniversary, and he was only 6 years old when he wrote it. I finally had a really good reason very recently for this to read it, and I'm so glad. Also joining us is Jeff Sparrow, who is the editor of Overland and also the author of numerous books, including Communism, a love story, and Killing Misadventures in Violence. He works at Victoria University, and his latest book is Money Shot, a journey into porn and censorship. And it was quite a journey. Jeff is the straight guy.
I must say, I do feel quite strange being here as a representative of straight people. I was listening to Triple M on the radio in the gym the other day, and you kind of thought, if this is straight culture, it's not really speaking to me. But
Dennis, I also know you're sick of talking about this masterpiece of a book, but you did write it 40 years ago. And I want to start by just asking how close or far away is contemporary gay culture from what you hoped for or imagined when you wrote this book?
Can I just, however, make a prefatory remark, which is the real beginnings of tonight is I read Money Shot, which I think is a terrific book, and I want to recommend it. And one of the reasons it's a terrific book is precisely that it is so rare for a straight man to come into the debates around sexuality. And I was really excited that Jeff had done that, and I think he's done it in ways that are very interesting and very intelligent. And that led to an exchange, a discussion between Jeff and me through email, which somehow at some point led to us all sitting up on the platform. So I just wanted to get that, that's the beginning. And of course the irony, and this takes me to your question, Sally, is that I'm always uneasy about the idea that the world is neatly divided into straight and gay anyway. The whole argument that my original book, Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, made, that came out very much of sort of radical Freudian Marxism of the 70s, was that sexuality is diffuse, malleable, changeable, that none of us have totally fixed sexual identities, although in reality most of us, of course, do develop fairly clear sexual identities, though they may well change over a lifetime. And therefore, at one level, we can talk about Jeff as the straight guy and me as the gay guy, but at another level, we have to remember that's a product of certain social and cultural conditioning. It's not innate, it's not fixed, it's not unchangeable. Although I don't think we're going to try and, in the next hour, prove that to you by direct demonstration. I'm not sure what Sally might have in mind. But So I think that when I wrote that book, I actually made a basic error, which is I assumed that as social mores changed and as there was greater acceptance of sexual diversity, which has happened, there would also be a decline of sexual identities, and I don't think that has happened. And I think that, in fact, we live in a world in which those two things somehow coexist, and the best place to see it is popular culture. So on the one hand, you can have a program like Gay Eye for the Straight Guy, in which the obvious script would be that one of those unattractive, dorky straight men falls for one of the attractive gay men. And that's never, of course, allowed, because the whole premise of the program is that there is an indivisible wall. On the other hand, you have a whole stream of popular culture in which sexuality is seen as fluid and malleable. And I'm thinking of something like, I don't know how many people here have seen a program like Tara. What's it called? You know, the
United States of Tara.
Thank you, the United States of Tara.
Much. I mean, so impressed with your pop culture.
Yes. Well, you know, or Glee. I mean, Glee is fascinating because in Glee, which is talking about contemporary teenage culture, okay, in Hollywood, but still it has relevance, I think, here. A lot of those kids do have a sexual fluidity and malleability. And I think in that sense, what we were struggling with at the beginning of the gay liberation movement is still a reality today.
Jeff, in your book, you talk about a magazine that was around, I think, in the early 70s, Thurunka.
That's right, yeah.
That was a radical magazine. Was it at Melbourne University?
One of the Sydney universities, University of New South Wales.
University of New South Wales. And one of the things you wrote about it, that it was, you know, you said it had a lot of silly stuff and whatnot, but that it wrote serious articles about homosexuality that today wouldn't be written with a view that perhaps a straight person or straight man would read them as for them as well.
Yeah, it's a very interesting magazine, Thurunka. If you ever get the chance to have a look at the old issues, it's fascinating if you get them out of the archives, and they're all bound now, and it gives them this kind of respectability. I remember when I was researching that book, sitting up there in the library and going through them, and you get this progression in the 60s. It's a tremendously respectable college magazine. It looks like this kind of second-rate copy of the Sydney Morning Herald, and then you get to the moment of sort of sexual liberation. All of a sudden it's full of these acid rock graphics and these unreadable headlines and these enormous penises coming out of it everywhere, and so on and so forth. The reason why I wanted to look at it was because when I was talking to various people in debates about pornography and censorship, which is what this book is about. It's a narrative where I have these conversations. There's an argument that runs through it about the role of the sexual revolution in producing the kind of sexual culture that we're in now. And there's a particular argument that you hear from people like Clive Hamilton, Melinda Tankard-Reist, and various others, that the moment when things go wrong is the sexual revolution. And this you can draw this direct connection between the commodified sexuality of today and the upsurge, this libidinal energy that comes out of the sexual revolution. Clive Hamilton in particular is very adamant about this, that what the sexual revolution is about self-expression, it's about individualism, it's about gratification, and all of these desires then lead into this kind of commodified sexual culture that you see at something like Sexpo. And what struck me actually when I looked at Thurunka, which I was kind of taking as an example of this, obviously it's not the only example, but it's one example, is that actually you see something quite different, and the kind of culture that's presented there looks very, very different from the sort of sexual expression that you will see in commercial pornography. And in fact, it doesn't fit into the conventional genres that we understand. And I think, to cut a long story short, I think, and it's kind of the conclusion of that book, is that what in fact we are dealing with now is the aftermath of the failure of the sexual revolution, not the consequences of its success, which is quite a different position from the one that Clive Hamilton ends up with.
Has it been a failure, Dennis? I noticed today it was reported that conversion therapy for minors has been banned in California, so that young people, can't go through these ludicrous...
Well, let's just go back to the central point. I mean, I should say I've always distrusted Clive Hamilton, and the things he said to you, Jeff, make me feel my distrust has been well-founded, because I don't think he has any understanding at all of how liberating some of the things he doesn't like were for people who were not privileged, middle-class, heterosexual men. And that's how he sees the world. And it's the sort of classic lefty self-congratulation that totally ignores what the world was like for, after all, the majority of people, if you include all women and those of us who are not heterosexual. It's absolutely true, I think, that capitalism and consumer capitalism has been enormously important in opening up possibilities for people to live different sorts of lives, and I would argue, on balance, much freer lives. And there's actually quite a long literature, and this is part of the discussion Jeff and I have had on, between ourselves. There's actually a lot of research has been done on the way in which consumer capitalism made it possible for people to adopt gay and lesbian identities. I mean, you think about what it was like for a woman attracted to other women in a historical period when women couldn't get decent jobs, when it was assumed that a woman would move from her parents' home to her husband's home. The way in which modern capitalism has helped destroy that is, I think, very liberating. And that's the part of the Hamilton argument that's the part that I think he just totally misses. Now, the other side of it, I agree. There is, and Jeff spends a lot of time, I think, pointing to some of the obviously pretty unpleasant and nasty aspects of the pornography industry. But what I really like about what Jeff's done is that he doesn't lose perspective. I mean, he's not equating the violence you see in porn videos with the violence we're currently seeing every night on television in Syria. And a lot of the anti-porn movement really does, I think, not make those distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a really interesting, it really is an interesting discussion, and one of the things that's kind of fascinating about it is the way that these arguments do always come back to history and do always come back to the history of particular struggles. And I think one of the things that makes the debates difficult is in Australia there's such a little historical memory that particularly of the struggles of the left, that these things are wiped from sent down the memory hole, such that the caricatures you get of the positions the left was taking on these things, I think that can be put around are grotesque. I mean, I don't want to be sledging Clive Hamilton here, and I would encourage you to read his articles yourself so you can see the position that the positions that he's putting forward. But I guess just following on from Dennis's position, I think one of the things that makes the argument so difficult is that consumer capitalism, or neoliberalism, if you like, is always presenting itself as a revolutionary radical force. That one of the things that neoliberalism does is it tears down hierarchies, it brings down the canon, it overthrows sacred cows, it demands that the playing field be levelled. Essentially, neoliberalism is about introducing every aspect of life to market principles. And I think Dennis is quite right about that. In some respects, this can be quite positive. I mean, the example that often comes to my mind is you think of what it meant to go and buy contraceptives 20 or 30 years ago, when you would have to go to a pharmacist and you would have to explain your marital status and why you wanted these things, whereas today one simply goes to a supermarket and, it's just another commodity that you put into your basket, and there's no difference between it and buying, a can of tuna or whatever.
Well, in fact, Jeff, if you go to a gay venue, they give them to you for nothing.
Well, there you go.
You're paying for them?
But
straight men have to suffer occasionally.
But of course, at the same time, precisely because market forces know no morality and in fact render the whole language of morality moot, such that increasingly the language of politics in Australia is posited simply in terms of supply and demand. It's simply in terms of a market framework. Precisely because of that, the very liberating aspects of the neoliberal process are precisely also those aspects that can be perceived as oppressive.
The changes that capitalism brought about that freed people with, to pursue their sexual identities and live very differently to the ways in which these dependent families previously had to live. It also, though, it created a backlash where the family then became, the place where support and nurture and emotional everything was there, and you brought your children up in this environment and they would then go on to be good workers and so on. But the family has become, I think, that central moral, political sort of word that, working families, everything revolves around this idea of a family, and implicit in that is a nuclear family still. How does that make you feel, Dennis?
Well, what you're describing, I suppose, first of all, I'd say is really the earlier stages of capitalism, the development of the nuclear family, and after all, in this country, the whole concept of the basic wage grew out of the idea that you had a nuclear family and that the man should earn enough to support the wife and children. Now, that has been breaking down over the last 30 years for all sorts of reasons. And of course, one of the great, this is where I think Jeff and I would probably be in agreement, it's one of the great ironies of modern capitalism, that the people who constantly talk about the need to support and bolster the traditional family are also the people who most enthusiastically support the market forces that are undermining it. So going to your question, I think that what both the gay and women's movements tried to do in the 70s were suggest alternative forms of family, and to suggest that often people create families that don't look like the nuclear family. My concern is that, there's something utopian about that, but there's something quite real about it. And my concern is that we're losing that edge of saying the family by itself is being undermined anyway. We could offer a different and a richer and a more diverse way of creating human relationships. That seems to have vanished from a lot of the discussion of both, I think, the women's and gay movements. The gay movement at the moment, or at least its vocal leadership, who have been in some ways very successful in framing the debate, seem to be totally obsessed with the idea of buying into an already defunct concept of marriage. The great achievement, it appears, of human history will be when two women or two men can walk down the aisle together in matching white tuxedos. I happen to think that is not a major achievement we should all be fighting for.
Is that also a kind of triumph of the liberal tolerance that you so abhorred, at least in the 40 years ago? That the idea of we'll let them get married too.
Yes. I should explain, there may be political theorists in the audience, and if there are, I should...
Identify yourself now.
Yes, get up and leave, because I'm not a very good theorist. But no, I was very influenced by Marcuse and Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance, which I think is really an important way of understanding a lot of the things Jeff's pointing to. Yes, I think that there is a sense in which marriage has become a token of people proving how open and accepting they are, but they don't have to talk about sex. And one of the things I find so fascinating about the same-sex marriage debate is that it means nobody actually has to talk about the realities of sexuality. It is assumed that somehow it's going to be the same. And of course, and this is an issue that I have taken up with Jeff, because if I were criticising his book, I would say what it doesn't do is allow for the fact that gay men particularly, I think more than lesbians, and I'm very happy if somebody wants to challenge me on this, have actually developed rather different ways of thinking about sexuality. And if you bring that into the picture, that actually starts changing to some extent the way in which you think about these issues. And that, I think, is something we're forgetting in the assumption that same-sex marriage is the be-all and end-all of equality.
Mm. Well, let me come back on that, on the points that I agree with and perhaps the points that I agree with somewhat less. On the question of capitalism and the family, I think Dennis puts it very well. There is a very strange phenomenon that takes place, not only in Australia, but you can see it particularly in the United States, where neoliberal politicians who glory in the wonders of the free market form these alliances with social conservatives who are opposed to everything that the free market brings about. And often this alliance takes place in the form of the one and the same politician who is simultaneously, socially conservative and neoliberal. And you get this strange feedback loop where you can whip people into a lather about the depravity of Hollywood and its cultural products, and Western civilization is falling apart and all the rest of it. Because they're whipped into a lather, they then vote for a right-wing politician who introduces more free market policies, which then fosters more of these films that promulgate further depravity and further sense that society is falling apart, which then allows people to whip themselves more into a lather. And you can see how it works in Australia. John Howard was very, very good about this. It produces this peculiar cultural sense where these cultural conservatives they seem to win every battle, yet they're always feeling that they're losing, and they're always feeling that they're being got at, and they're aggrieved, and society is always going to hell in a handbasket. No matter how much they win, things just get worse and worse and worse. So one of the peculiar things that happens in the 1980s is that precisely as the neoliberal revolution begins to bite, most families come under pressure in a way that they haven't done before, as there's fewer services around and all the rest of it, and suddenly it becomes harder to find jobs. And it's precisely then that the idea of family values starts to become promulgated. Precisely as the family is under pressure, then these notions of traditional families become more and more important. So, I think it's certainly true that the family is an institution that has changed tremendously, and anyone who starts to talk to you about this sort of eternal verities of the nuclear family simply hasn't done the research, because there's never been any such thing. But specifically on the question of the debate about same-sex marriage, it seems to me that it doesn't seem to me to such a difficult question. I have no great desire to defend marriage as an institution, and there's all sorts of reasons why people on the left should be very, very suspicious about institutions that call on people to declare their relationships before the state or before religious bodies. There's all sorts of reasons for that. But I would have thought the basic question is simply, this is a democratic right. This is a form in which a kind of bigotry that would not otherwise be tolerated is allowed to be promulgated in society. And for me, it's rather akin to the debates about women serving in the army. Now, I'm not a great fan of the army. I'm not encouraging anyone to join the army. But if you have a situation where some people are told that they cannot do this, then there's a clear implication in terms of oppression. And I totally agree with Dennis about the collapse of a radical imagination. I mean, in the course of reading this book, I was looking again at Shulamith Firestone's book, The Dialectic of Sex, and the radicalism of the vision. I mean, in some ways it's quite a strange book, but the radicalism of the vision there in terms of what a different kind of society and what a different kind of sexuality might look like is totally different from the relationship today. But just to finish on the same-sex marriage thing, I think if you look at any social movement, it's the victories that are achieved that allows people to go on to make more radical visions. It seems to me that at the moment, the constant defeat of the move to reform this, these bigoted laws emboldens reactionaries. And if we were able to push this quite simple reform through, it would then open some space to begin to talk about some more radical alternatives.
Well, can I just make clear? I support. I mean, now that the issue has been put on the agenda, I support the passing of the legislation. I've had strange conversations with all these well-meaning straight politicians who are somewhat bemused by the fact that I don't find it a very exciting or important issue, but I support them. How can I not? I'm not going to end up on the same side as Cardinal Pell against Penny Wong, and in that political environment, I support it. However, I don't agree with Jeff that it will lead on to a more radical critique. And I suppose I think there are two conversations. I think it's it's important because it's provided a way in which the larger society has had to think about the reality that there is still inequality for people who are not conventionally heterosexual. But within the homosexual world, it really bothers me that it's become the dominant issue. I was talking today to people who work at the Australian Communities Foundation because I was trying to find out, are there groups who are working with new immigrant and particularly refugee communities around sexuality? Now, the reality is there's virtually nothing going on, virtually nothing being funded. And at the same time, it is very easy to get celebrity after celebrity. Every third-rate, washed-up celebrity wants to now do a benefit for same-sex marriage. And this seriously bothers me. We've got our perspectives totally wrong. I do not believe if we get same-sex marriage, we've seen this in the United States, it has not led, in the states where they have it, it hasn't produced a new radicalism. What it's done is given conservative middle-class homosexuals the possibility of further integrating into society as it is and to be even less interested in other issues. Now, I think, yes, it's a good thing the bill should pass, but at the same time, people like us, Jeff, need to be able to maintain some sort of radical critique. You can support, as you said with the military, you can support that, but still say there are some big issues behind this.
Well, I don't know then. I'm not sure necessarily how much we disagree about that, but it seems to me like it's a very old strategic argument. I mean, it goes back to those 19th century debate about whether radicals should support what were known as palliatives, reforms that don't overthrow the system. And the argument was made then very strongly that, well, if one accepts things like the 8-hour day, then you're legitimising the very existence of wage labour. Instead of doing that, we should say, well, we want to get rid of the entire system. And I mean, look, I'm a socialist. I do want to get rid of the entire system. I would much rather people, in the gay and lesbian community and every other community were saying, let's talk about the economic system we live in rather than simply talking about marriage. But the fact remains, this is an issue that's mobilising large numbers of people. And to be honest, if washed-up celebrities want to throw benefits saying, I'm with gay and lesbian people against the bigots, well, that would never have happened when I was a kid. It just never would have happened.
No,
that's clearly a good thing.
Can I just make one last point on this? I think where I get really concerned is when for example, the statement that President Obama made, right, which was hailed. He'd gone through his vale of tears, journey to Damascus, all the rest of it. Come on, some of you know the Bible better than I do because I don't know it all. And he evolved, right? And he evolved, and he said, I support same-sex marriage. In that statement, he made clear that what he meant by that was monogamy. And he quite specifically said that. Now, as someone who comes out of a community that has always said monogamy is a myth, I've been in a relationship for 22 years. And one of the things that gay men know and are much more honest about than most other people, to be frank, is that monogamy isn't really a very good way of maintaining a relationship. Nor should we measure fidelity to another person purely on the basis of sexual fidelity. And what really worries me is when the proponents of same-sex marriage start arguing, look, we're just like you, because I don't want to be just like you, if that means buying into it. So I think, Jeff, it is possible to maintain the critique without necessarily saying, I mean, you probably, ironically, are keener on overthrowing the whole system than I am. This is sort of one of the great ironies, I think, of tonight, that probably on other political issues I'd be to Jeff's right. On this, I'm clearly to Jeff's left, so the seating was quite intelligent, Sally.
Thank you. Jeff, do you think Dennis, in what he's saying about gay promiscuity, or is that a fair enough way to put it, Dennis?
Well, promiscuity really is the term you use about someone who gets more sex than you do. So let's not get into this front side,
okay.
because this is not confession hour.
Okay,
but I think
you know what I'm talking about.
But the point I'm making is that gay culture has always celebrated sexual adventure. And I think that is something that straight culture could learn from. And I am therefore deeply uneasy when we get the reverse phenomenon and we get large numbers of spokespeople for my community saying we really just want to have, pledge monogamy for life, which we know from the research suggests they're either deluded or hypocritical.
Well, I'm wondering, Jeff, if your research can help us with this, because the explosion in pornography with straights is that some sort of deep repression of what Dennis is alluding to? Is this a sort of outlet, or what's going on there?
Well, look, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, and one of the reasons I wanted to write it in the format that it is, where it's not an analytical text, it's a narrative in which I talk to various people and get their perspectives on these debates, is because I think the discussion about sexual politics has become utterly toxic. That this is an issue that people feel very personally about for obvious kind of reasons. People have a lot of investment in their sexuality. Our sexuality is very, very complex, and it's not something that we can necessarily make decisions about. One could decide, I would like my sexuality to be like this, and in fact my sexuality is like this. So one of the things that mattered to me, and this is really kind of simple, and again, this is probably quite a liberal point really, that I kind of think we need to be nicer to each other, and we need to be nicer to ourselves in our discussions about sexuality. So that, I think, specifically in terms of this discussion about promiscuity, I guess I would say that I'm not really for making an argument about any particular normative form of sexuality. I think that there are all kinds of sexual expressions that people have, and that there are some particular ways of expressing sexuality that work for some people and not for others. I'm very wary of claims that people should conduct themselves in this particular way, whether that is that everyone should be monogamous, or whether it is that everyone should be, polygamous, or any other kind of sexuality. And one of the things that came out when I was talking to people, the tremendous pressure that people feel under now, that there is always someone who is doing it better than you are. There is always someone out there that you see on the internet, or you read about in one of these magazines, who has some much better sex life, whether that means they're not having sex or they're having more sex or whatever. I don't think this is very. I don't think this is very useful. And to me, I guess the conclusion I came to in the book is that, well, if you want to change sexuality, you need to change the society in which that sexuality is expressed. And at the moment, we are in a society that's tremendously divided, that actively seeks to foster competition and individualism and a kind of amoral, almost autistic indifference to other people. And as a result, many of us are very deeply damaged by this. And I've forgotten what the question was.
But I agree.
Me too.
No, I mean, I think the really interesting thing that you said was people should be both more accepting and kinder to each other. And you're right. And a lot of the rhetoric that you actually tap... I mean, you don't... When I say you tap into it, I mean, you're talking to people who hold very, very strong views. And in fact, there are a couple of really interesting places where you say, I felt quite nervous about going to talk to someone because of the way they hold these views. I think that is really important. I'm certainly not saying... I'm not prescribing anything. All I'm saying is that we should, if we are going to recognise sexual diversity, let's... And I'm saying this really to people who are part of the gay world and the gay community. Let's actually celebrate some of the aspects of the gay world that are rather different. And as I've said to Jeff, I think the experience of gay male porn is rather different. And I actually checked back on something I'd written some time ago. I remembered an event when I was teaching at the Trobe in the 80s. I co-taught a course on sexuality and gender, and of course I co-taught it only with women because, you know, only women and poofs do these sorts of things. And we had an evening in which we all went and looked at porn. And one stage we looked at some gay male porn, and the women said, "My God." Firstly, they said the men are much better looking. Because one of the things about straight porn that I've always found so weird is that, of course, the women have to fit conventional stereotypes of good looks. The men are often extremely unattractive, unfit, spotty, you know, all the rest of it. Let's not go further. And the other thing they said is, you know, this is really interesting because the power dimensions are very different when it involves two men than when it involves a man and a woman. And I think that is interesting. Now, I'm not, you know, but in saying that, I'm not trying to prescribe anything for anybody else. I'm just saying that we have a variety of ways of seeing this, and that I regret that so much of the gay movement isn't prepared to say, maybe we have ways of seeing this that's a bit different, rather than the current mood, which is to constantly say, you know, we're just like you. And therefore, if you just give us this last little right, we'll prove to you we're just like you. Well, I don't want to prove that.
Jeff, you're across this because as part of your field work for this book, you went and did a course with the Classification Board, which is a really interesting part of this book. And in doing that, you had to watch straight porn, gay porn, work out what the classification system was. And, well, you tell us a bit about what you found and the differences between straight and gay porn and how much gay porn was just not given a classification. And therefore was not legal, was not able to be...
Well, I mean, the classification system in Australia is a very interesting phenomenon. We probably don't have time to go into it in that much detail. Suffice to say that classification in Australia is in profound ideological crisis for all sorts of reasons. I mean, partly the basic framework that federal classification works under is quite liberal. It sort of comes directly out of the anti-censorship struggles of the 1970s. So there's quite a liberal framework where the classifiers say basically what we're doing is providing labels so people can choose what they want to see. At the same time, there's a variety of stipulations that came out of the backlash to this in the 1980s.
Like candle wax.
That's right, where there's a whole series of particular fetishes that are prescribed. So, for instance, in X-rated films, you cannot show any violence. Now, this sounds normal and sensible. Nobody wants rape videos to be, you know, proselytised or whatever. But what they actually mean is you can't show any violence whatsoever, even if it's not connected to sexuality. So that means that more or less any X-rated film that has a plot, because most plots involve a degree of conflict, and that will manifest itself by, say, a fist fight or a gun battle, those films must be, by law, refused classification. There's certain fetishes that by law must be refused classification: bondage, fisting, various other things that they're just there in the legislation, and the classifiers have no choice. But it's even more nonsensical than that, because while there is a federal classification of X, the states don't have corresponding laws. So in most of the population centres, it's legal to own X-rated videos, it's legal to buy X-rated videos, it's illegal to sell them. So all the sex shops are illegal, every single one. So obviously... In
Swanston Street, everywhere,
they're all illegal. They're all illegal. And of course,
this.
because the laws aren't enforced, but yet the shops must be outside the law, that means they don't obey any of the other classifying laws. So they sell refused classification stuff as well. And of course, there's an extra layer of absurdity on this, because at the same time, all of this material is available on the internet that anyone can access anyway. So the whole thing is in total crisis. I mean, the best measure of how absurd it has become is to think of one of the stipulations about material that's refused classification is bondage. This is abhorrent and unnatural, that must be banned. But yet the biggest selling book ever in Australian publishing history is 50 Shades of Grey, and this is explicitly a book about, you know, sexuality and bondage that you can buy on, you know, you can, well, it's available in my supermarket. I saw it the other day next to the fresh fruit. You can pick up a copy of 50 Shades of Grey. Just very quickly on the gay porn, straight porn. Now, this is not an area that I profess to know very much about, but I do think the distinctions that Dennis were talking about are actually breaking down as the adult industry becomes bigger and bigger. And in fact, a large number of the male adult, the male heterosexual porn stars, although it's an industry secret, they actually moonlight in gay porn and cross over back and forth because there's more money in gay porn. So I suspect that breakdown between good-looking gay stars and ugly heterosexual stars is breaking down.
Well, I hope for the sake of the people who are watching heterosexual porn, you're right.
Has anybody got a question for one of these two gentlemen, or both of them? Just put your hand up, and somebody with a microphone will be there in a flash.
I have a question for Dennis, although you might have kind of answered it, but I'll ask you anyway. When you were talking about gay marriage earlier on, you mentioned that you don't necessarily want to be part of it because gay men in particular have defined sexuality differently. I was just hoping you could explain what you meant by that, and if it was more than just monogamy, and what you meant.
Look, I think I mean two things. One is something that Jeff actually said. I usually explain it by saying I've been in a relationship for over 20 years. I think it's terrific that our relationship does not need the blessing of the church or the state. But it is important to note that in Australia, we are recognised for almost all legal purposes as a couple, and this is enormously important because it is quite different to the situation in the United States. So were I in the United States, I would be a much more enthusiastic supporter of same-sex marriage because it brings a whole set of benefits that are not available, that are available to us as a same-sex couple in Australia. The second thing I'd say, which goes to part of your question, is gay men, I think, have always accepted that going into a primary relationship should not be measured by monogamy. That, as I say, the gay world has a whole set of outlets for sexual adventure and instant sexual gratification. I don't know how many people in this room are aware of applications like Grindr, where, and if I had to switch my phone off, this being a rule of the Wheeler Centre. If I hadn't had to switch my phone off, I could actually have been sitting here finding out how many available men there are
in this audience.
In the room. I mean,
perhaps you can just put your hand up.
Well, they may choose not to reveal themselves. This takes us into the outing question, which we haven't got into. No, but I do seriously think that what bothers me, I think, is the assumption that commitment to someone who you're saying is your partner in life is measured so strongly by sexual fidelity, because it is possible to be emotionally unfaithful to someone in ways that I think is much more damaging and hurtful than having casual sex on the side. And that's, I think, the ground rules of an awful lot of gay relationships. And I suppose, as I said, I want to say again, I support the legislation. I've talked to the people like Adam Bant, like Stephen Jones, who are introducing the legislation. I support it. I wanted to go through. I wanted to go through immediately so we can stop having the debate. But at the same time, I'm really uneasy when people assume that it means we're all going to buy into what is, I think, a very traditional and outmoded institution which carries with it the assumption that your life partner is the only person you're allowed to have sex with.
Just wait for the microphone.
I have to say, I'm sorry that I've forgotten your name.
Jeff.
Jeff, could you respond to what Dennis has said? Because it sounds a bit like maybe straight men who are married have pretty boring sex lives. I'm not sure.
Or do all men really want to have as much sex as Dennis is describing?
Well, I mean,
Which you're not every man, so that's...
I'm not married, and I'm not going to talk to you about my sex life either. But... look, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult for me to tell, like, how much I disagree with Dennis on this issue, or to the extent we're simply putting forward a different perspective on it. I mean, I think that passing this legislation would be an important reform, and I think it would have a series of consequences that I think would be good. It would break the nexus between the Labor Party and the Australian Christian lobby. It would prevent a whole series of high-profile homophobes having the degree of public platforms that they're having at the moment. It would be the most prominent success of a major grassroots reform movement that we can think of in recent history. I think, and Dennis disagrees with me about this, but I think it's quite likely to inspire people to want to go further and to put forward other demands. So for all of those reasons, I think this is an important campaign and one that people should support. I don't think that that means that one should fetishise marriage or claim that, you know, the right to, that once one is married that all of a sudden, you know, all of your problems go away, because we all know married people and this clearly isn't the case. At the same time, and I don't really discuss this in the book, but I am sceptical of claims that that sexual radicalism translates into political radicalism. As I said, I think that sexuality takes a variety of different forms, and that people find, you know, the form that works for them. But I think it's perfectly possible for people in traditional monogamous relationships to be politically radical, and it's quite possible for people in you know, experimental you know, relationships of various kinds to be politically conservative as well. So I think one of the experiences of the last 30 years is that simply experimenting with different forms of sexuality doesn't necessarily translate into changing the world.
Look,
and
I'd agree with that. And in fact, that goes right back to the question you asked at the beginning, Sally, about when I wrote Homosexual Oppression and Liberation. I think in the early 70s there was this idea that if you were a sexual radical, you were inevitably going to be aligned with other forms of radical protest and radical change. I think Jeff's absolutely right. That's not true. And also, you know, I don't disagree with you, Jeff, because I think that the reality is, I think it would be too arrogant of me. I may have all these reservations, but Jeff's right. For an awful lot of young homosexuals now, this is a really important issue. And therefore, I think I should support them. And, you know, I've made clear, I actually had to give up a $1,000 gig. And I was very frustrated. I don't get offered many $1,000 gigs to go on a television debate arguing against marriage. And I did it because I felt I'm not prepared to publicly, as I've said before, align myself with the opponents of marriage. So I think there's a difference. We at a theoretical level, one can have a position, but what Jeff's saying about the practical politics of it at the moment, I think you'd find we're probably in quite close agreement.
Yep. Do you have a sense, either of you or both of you, about, you talk about those other radical movements, and gay liberation, feminist movement, women's movement, and race. Of those three that were burning hot, or 40 years ago, do you have a sense of which one has come the furthest?
I would say, I think the gay movement has been remarkably successful. It's been remarkably successful in that we now have this debate. The fact that very few people who are, even the people who are opposing same-sex marriage, are prepared to publicly say they're not in favour of rights for homosexuals is extraordinary. Remember, if we think 40 years ago, in every state in this country, male homosexual behaviour was illegal. Female homosexuality was so horrendous that it couldn't even be made illegal. But the idea that homosexuality was either criminal, deviant, or an illness or a sin was very widespread. Now, in Australia today, there are something like 20 to 30% who still have some of those views. I mean, there's been enough research, we know that. They're articulated by people like Archbishops Pell and Jensen, both of whom still hold to the idea of the sin. But basically, the moral centre has shifted enormously. And the acceptance of sexual diversity and increasingly gender diversity, I think, has been quite extraordinary. It seems to me it goes hand in hand, though, with the development of both much greater equality for women, though certainly not total equality, and we've seen a whole set of very nasty examples the last few weeks of where that's clearly the case. It also goes, I think, in Australia, is very much connected with the development of multiculturalism. And, for a long time I've said most ordinary Australians would actually be more comfortable having a lesbian bar at the end of the street than a mosque. And that's, reflecting a whole set of complicated ways in which we now think about ourselves. But my sense, as someone who's lived through a lot of these changes, is that the development of multiculturalism, the recognition of how different we are to the country that I grew up in, which was absolutely overwhelmingly white Anglo-Irish, that to me is the biggest change in this country, and the way in which acceptance of greater diversity, therefore, in other areas has come along, it seems to me, is deeply connected with it.
Well, look, I would agree with that. I guess the only thing I'd add to it is that these things are still very uneven, and that there are pockets. And not only pockets that haven't changed, there are areas that have clearly become worse. I mean, the horrendous rise of an Islamophobic bigotry that manifests in ways that I remember. I was doing a research project where I was looking back at these little far right groups from the 70s and the 80s. It was really striking reading these neo-Nazi pamphlets. They're raging about how the Jews run the world and this and that and the other. That the word Muslim does not appear once. And then, whereas the comparative groups now, it's all the Muslims are running the world and Sharia law is going to happen and all the rest of it. So there's that thing. The other thing I think is the hostility to refugees didn't exist in this form 10 or 20 years ago. That the level of vitriol directed against asylum seekers, I think, is quite new. But just finally, I think the area in which we have gone backwards the most in the last 30 years are the debates about the economy. That if you look at those arguments in the early 70s, it was taken for granted that there were different ways of organising the world. Not everyone would agree with the particular proposals in mind, but absolutely no one would say there is only one way and there is no alternative. Whereas today, it's taken for granted that the free market is not simply the best way of organising the world, it's the only way that the world can be organised. And if anyone tells you different, then they are totally crazy and totally outside the loop. And, you know, the mainstream economic position now is one that, you know, in 1970 would have been held only by the extreme right.
Dennis, the last word. Our time is almost up.
I think that one of the odd things is that we have we live in a society that is saturated with sexual images. We live in a society in which pornography is enormously available in all sorts of ways. And at the same time, we have remarkably little intelligent discussion about sexuality. And I think that was really, I guess, why we're here tonight. We desperately need to go back to some of the earlier discussions, which were actually much more sophisticated and interesting than the ones that are currently on offer, even though I'm not sure that I really want to spend lots of time rereading Shalom at Firestone.
But I was so happy to read your work.
Oh, well, of course, and you will read Jeff and me eternally.
He wrote this in his 20s. I can't believe it. We do have to wrap it up. Go and get these books. They're both pink. They make a lovely double set. And
yes, yours should be blue, Jeff.
I want to thank you both very, very much for your very frank and insightful conversation tonight. Dennis Altman and Jeff Sparrow, thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for coming along to the Fifth Estate as well. If you don't know, it is a fortnightly series on a Tuesday evening where we kind of take a current topic but do something really interesting with the best possible people. In 2 weeks' time, we are doing something slightly different. We've got all the Lord Mayor candidates, including the current Lord Mayor, and they're going to come and sit right here and have a big community stoush with them. So it might be the only time where they're all actually together. So that's the Fifth Estate in 2 weeks. Have a lovely night and thanks for coming.